Well, they try to steady me. I'll go ahead and get going. I took off my jacket, so maybe you won't notice that I've already been up here before, and it'll be a fresh idea and fresh thoughts. One of the things that I ran into, and I was talking with Judge Bennett, former Judge Bennett from Helena, a little bit on the out during one of the breaks, and Judge Bennett said, you know, that was probably the best meal I've ever had at a conference. I mean, did that come from the Finn and Porter? Where'd it come from? And, you know, I said, of course, well, Judge, if you look at my eyes, I'm a little bit tired because I was up cooking this morning. And more often than not, unfortunately, what happens is one individual gets all the credit for putting together something like this. And no, I didn't cook. And also, by the same token, I think it's important that we recognize, you know, getting national speakers in and things, it takes a tremendous amount of work, getting something like this together. So I'd like to, if you don't mind, before I start, just recognize a few of my staff, and many others worked on it, but then if you'll give them a round of applause once I introduce them all, I'd ask you to stand. First, Jenny Eck, who's the outreach coordinator for the Office of Consumer Protection, did most of the legwork in pulling this together. Jim Malloy, who you've seen a couple of times, the Chief of Consumer Protection, who walked out as soon as I'm starting to talk. I still got to work on staff. Matt Dale, Matt's in back. Give a wave, Matt, who's the director of the Office of Consumer Protection and Victim Services, and Jonah Leal, who's program specialist. Please join me in giving them a round of applause, because without them, this wouldn't happen. You know, it's interesting in some respects. The topic has been consumer protection, largely, you know, what happens with the federal act and how it applies here. But and can you still all hear me well? I'm used to hearing myself so loud as my children are. I don't know when I don't have a microphone that close. But briefly want to talk a little bit about what the Attorney General does with consumer protection. And it's, I first got to know the Commissioner of Banking, Annie Goodwin, over a decade ago, when consumer protection was essentially Annie Goodwin, and it was attached to, at the time, Department of Commerce. We were one of 2 or 3 states in the country where the Attorney General didn't have primary enforcement authority over consumer protection matters. And Annie was essentially the whole staff. Sometime after Annie left, it was attached to Department of Administration for a while. And finally, in 2005, the legislature changed and made the Attorney General's office having principal consumer protection authority. And when I ran, it was one of the things that I had said that I really want to beef up, and I really want to make a difference. And I think that we've worked hard to make it more than, you know, something attached to something else. We've added attorneys, we've added resources. Right now we field about an average of 600 consumer calls a month, mediate literally thousands of complaints, written complaints each year, recovered millions of dollars from Montana consumers. Examples of some of the things that we've run into just in the last, I guess, 20 months. There was a company called Airtel Wireless. Airtel Wireless was a Minnesota-based phone company, only operated in Montana. It required, basically, its whole product was to sell prepaid, typically individuals that couldn't necessarily get a Verizon contract or others. Airtel Wireless sold phone service till Friday night at 5 o'clock, closed their doors, fired all their employees. On Saturday, they shut off the phones. Ultimately, the most any individual could be out is $50 or $100. But with something like that, that's $50 or $100 that's not going to go to pay for something else that they need, and the $50 or $100 can make a big difference. Went after them. There was some discussion about declaring bankruptcy. Got $77,000 back into the hands of Montana consumers. Another example is an elderly man who lives alone, and he's watching the late night television, and I'll be darned if he doesn't figure out he can get rich off of selling real estate. Sounded pretty good. Yeah, you know, he's kind of looking at his credit card statements, and more than There's also some other charges tacked on. By the time we got together with him, $70,000 had been out of his pocket. We got that reversed. Another example is a disabled veteran paid $4,400 in fees to a debt reduction company that did absolutely nothing to reduce his credit card debt. I mean, Commissioner Brill was talking a little bit this morning about these debt settlement companies and what the role has been for quite a while in a lot of areas, and you can see them on television. They'll say, you have a lot of debt, we'll settle those. So what you need to do is give us money or put it into a separate account, and when your creditors call, don't worry about it. So, but literally what has been happening since these popped up is then they'll end up, the debt settlement company will get $4,000, $3,000. Every payment that's made goes to them first, and the creditors aren't getting paid, even the local creditors. Credit rating gets destroyed, they're sued. That's something that we've been doing quite a bit of work on, and I think we'll do more. It's nice that the Federal Trade Commission rules now say you can't take the money up front. You actually have to provide a service before you can get paid, which isn't a bad way to live. Another example would be an 84-year-old woman in Bozeman. I don't know how many of you have gotten phone calls saying, do you need, you now have the opportunity to extend your auto warranty. And this woman, 84 years old, bought 15 extended auto warranties, didn't even own a car. And if any of you have ever engaged with some of these people that are calling, I mean, they're good at what they do, and we got the $6,600 and $6,673 back. Those are a few of the cases that we've dealt with out of hundreds and then mediating thousands of complaints over the last year. So I guess two things. One is that if you take nothing out of what I say, which may be fair, take this, 444-4500 or 1-800-481-6896. Those are the numbers, either local or statewide, to our Consumer Protection Office. If you or anyone else gets scammed, 444-4500, 800-481-6896. And the second, which I think it's important to understand, is that, and the Consumer Protection Act, as was alluded to earlier, essentially saying that, and we have enforcement authority over it, unfair deceptive acts of businesses, we can bring an action. But when you think about those examples that I threw out to you, not a one of them is where Bill Bickle is in Miles City. I mean, not a one of them is our Main Street businesses. Because by and large, and we do end up mediating complaints or otherwise dealing with Montana businesses. But by and large, I mean, we know, I used to say at one point that Montana is a small high school that no one graduates from. And I say that in a constructive way. I mean, from the perspective of that reputation matters and the ability to stay in business matters. And unfortunately, when something like that happens with an extended auto warranty, a debt settlement company, any number of a cell phone company, that hurts Main Street business because we're all, first of all, a little bit more skeptical. And it gives everybody a black eye. And these aren't companies that are necessarily going to be in it for the long haul. So hopefully at the same time that we're making a real push to better protect our consumers, we're also at the same time better protecting our Montana businesses. And also through the mediation process, when a complaint comes to our office, what we do is we reach out to the business. We can resolve some of these up front so it doesn't end up in litigation and black eyes and things like that down the road, even between the private parties. So good things are happening. I think we have a lot of work to do. The topic, of course, today is the passage of this new Wall Street financial reform, the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau. And you've heard good chunks of it, but it's critical to recognize that what we have right now at the federal level is an alphabet soup. We have OCC, OTS, Federal Reserve, National Credit Union Administration, FTC, all somewhat tasked with watching out for the consumer. But that's one of just a little piece of what they do. I mean, somebody said it's kind of looking, different regulators looking at a little piece of an elephant, and no one fully understood the animal or saw what it was till it darn near trampled over a lot of people. With it being that, I guess, diffracted and torn apart, I think that the new CPFB provides great opportunities. And it really does provide great opportunities to say, let's have one agency, one entity that's focused on the person, on the small business, on the individual, and let's make sure that their task is to ensure that that person isn't taken advantage of, that what we've seen over the last couple decades doesn't happen again. I appreciate Bill Bickle's point of saying, well, there is something to be said for a prudential regulator, and there certainly is. But the communication that hopefully will occur as this unwinds that the prudential regulators will be speaking to the Consumer Protection Agency, and we'll all be better off as a result. Commissioner Goodwin said that, talked a little bit about the Glass-Steagall Act. I mean, if we think about it, history has shown that businesses can play by the rules and still prosper and do well. I mean, that act was passed in 1933, right, following the crash in 1929. Meaningful reform that we ended up having. And it served our country well. The markets were stabilized, economy grew, families saved, they bought homes that they could afford. Unfair predatory practices weren't kind of the norm at the time. And then for 50 years, essentially, then Wall Street and everybody else was playing by this set of rules. There is the uncertainty now as we have what will happen here, and I can appreciate how the uncertainty causes a degree of heartburn. But the rules that were there and were established then, as the commissioner had said, with Gramm-Leach-Bliley and things, the rules started changing in the 1980s. And ultimately, as a result of those rules, there are large financial firms that did well, and there are people in our communities and elsewhere that paid the price. And for those that are unemployed, or for those families that are in the midst of foreclosure, and I think that Senator Tester is absolutely correct, that in some respects, we're seeing some good things start to happen. That doesn't help somebody in the Bitterroot, that doesn't help somebody in the Flathead or Gallatin County, doesn't help you if you're gonna lose your house, but I'm hopeful that times are starting to change. But I'd also say that it ain't over yet, and that we are still gonna have continuing challenges. I mean, one example of, I guess, playing fast and loose potentially with the rules that we haven't solved, and we certainly won't, the notion of an agency finally being up in July 2011 isn't gonna, I wish I could say at the culmination of today's session, life will be great and we can all skip out and be happy and our economy's restored. But think about one example is the mortgage electronic registration system, created over a decade ago. Made it possible for millions of US mortgages to be sold and resold all over the world at lightning speed. What great advantages technology brings in some respects. But in other respects, Wall Street and hedge funds managers, they're slicing, they're dicing these mortgages, they're chopping them up, they're selling them. We've got property laws. We have things that aren't necessarily then tied and following with it throughout. So now we have another mess. Hundreds of thousands of homes in foreclosure without necessarily the documents supporting all the way along that traditionally would prove who owns those loans, who has title to them. Another that Commissioner Brill had mentioned is just today, she had said 49 state AGs came together and announced an investigation. Fortunately, Alabama was a little bit of a holdout, but now 50 are on board. And for that to occur, I go to my national meetings and things. Herding AGs is like herding cats. It's not very often that you're going to have all 50 on board. But what this was looking at least in part, is foreclosure factory mills. I mean, a Bank of America mortgage official who says, in a deposition recently, I would typically sign off on 7,000 to 8,000 foreclosure documents a month without reading them, without reading what was behind them, because there were just so many of them. GMAC, which she said that Attorney General Cordray in Ohio sued over 10,000. I mean, what we had is cranking out the documentation, let's get the foreclosures complete, without any sort of assurances necessarily that all of the protections were followed for the consumers, all the T's dotted, all the I's crossed. Does that mean that all the foreclosures out there are bad? By no measure. And it is tough times. But it also means, like what a Bank of America said on a national level, is we need to stop and see what happened and what's happening. So we're going to take a period of reprieve to make sure that all of the rules are being followed, so we're not putting people out with their most significant purchase, the most significant thing in their life, that we're not taking it away absent following the laws that are there in place to protect both the banks and ultimately the consumer. So I think that there are challenges, and there's going to continue to be challenges that hopefully our office, the Commissioner's office, the feds will continue to look at. But I'm also cautiously optimistic, even though there's the regulatory uncertainty, that the Wall Street reform package is going to correct, or it's designed at least to correct some of the mistakes and some of the challenges that we've seen in the past 25 years. Congress clearly saw, I guess, the need to restore responsibility, accountability, and oversight, and it did it. And it's the most significant thing since the 1930s in that respect. And I think it's critical to understand that, as Commissioner Brill, who's flying back to Washington, D.C., noted, both in her speech and otherwise, it's a long way from here to Washington, D.C. It's not necessarily always easy to get here. And I'll be darned if people aren't more friendly and say hello in the street. You know, it's just a different world to a certain extent. And I think there's no way that we can reasonably expect regulators 2,500 miles away in Washington, D.C. Can always effectively protect consumers, small businesses throughout the entire nation. And, you know, they speak of, at times, of the AGs and the regulators as the financial cops on the beat. But the nice thing, I think, about having that shared responsibility is I'll hear about the problem. Yeah, we have our 1-800 numbers, but I'll hear about the problems when I'm taking my kids to the grocery store or at a church or otherwise, that people will actually, by having regulators in the communities and not just relying upon Washington, D.C., we're a lot closer to the ground, and ultimately feel and hear the impacts, not just in an abstract, hypothetical economic model, but by talking to our friends and our neighbors. And I did want to underscore, because also I wrote in my notes when Senator Tester said, I need to repeat this, Steve, thanks to the efforts of senators. But the idea, one of the last votes on the whole package was whether or not attorneys general should be preempted. So whether we should make sure that AGs can no longer do any of the regulatory authority, no longer can enforce deceptive practices. It's an interesting, because, I mean, as we know, that the Commissioner of Banking's office has a very, very significant role to play, and always will. And ours, in some respects, on part of it, is the bit player in the big band. We have this Consumer Protection Act. So it's working together, and it's often doing different things. But what you don't want to do, and what ultimately was really heartened that Congress didn't do, is say, okay, as we go to design this new federal system, we're going to take the 50 cops off the beat. We're going to cut the AGs out. But it was one of, I guess, the last votes, and one of the more difficult things. I'm fortunate that with my colleagues, I'm the co-chair, the national co-chair of the Consumer Protection Task Force, or the committee of the AGs Association, so that universally, and I guess there's another area where you could say AGs are like herding cats. We may not agree on everything, but one thing that we agree, no matter what part of the country you're in or what political party you are, is that to preempt our authority and just hope then, even though we're going to be the ones hearing the complaints, to preempt it and hope that the feds will always take care of it, is no way to actually operate. And we were virtually uniform as the act was going through Congress and saying that we not only need to have the authority to act, but actually we'd like to roll back some of the preemption that had occurred in the past. I think that Bill said, the commissioner, Federal Trade Commissioner said, and others, that the devil will be in the details, right? That we're going to have all these administrative rules. We're going to have all these hearings. So we don't know exactly everything that's going to come out of this at the end. But what we do know is as much, I guess, regulatory uncertainty as we have now, that what we've been doing, it ain't working. And it hasn't worked for Main Street. In some respects, our highs in Montana are never as high as some places. So when I talk to my colleague in Arizona about their foreclosure rates, I mean, our highs were never as high, so our lows can't be as low. I mean, but by the same token, we felt it all throughout the state that what has happened hasn't been working. So the notion of bringing all this together, creating this new agency, giving that agency so that there's somebody that we can turn to in Washington and say, that's your job now. Not part of the alphabet soup, that's your job. And to know that they'll work with us as the state AGs, just as Commissioner Brill, I mean, we're having more and more federal and state task force and working together on the issues because they have some resources, they have some things that they can work on. When we can work in concert, I think ultimately, all of Main Street, all of us are a little bit better protected. I think that the credit needs to go to those who crafted it. And there was something about, and maybe it was also when Commissioner Goodwin spoke about the way that the rules have, laws that used to be 19 pages are now 2,700 and things. And I think I read somewhere before the bill was even fully introduced, there had been $220 million spent in lobbying for this consumer protection, either lobbying for or against it. So it's a complex world, but there needs to be at least some credit to credit given where credit is due when you start to look at what were some of the largest predatory loan problems. You heard about Countrywide and the $8.7 billion settlement. That was an action brought by state AGs. You heard about Beneficial, another one where the AGs came together. So the credit where credit, I think, is due is that ultimately the states are going to continue to play a critical role in making sure that people play by the rules. The states are close down. And as Montana's Attorney General, I do look forward to working with the feds, the banking interests, consumer groups, and otherwise, as hopefully we get those details put into the devil and it ultimately becomes an angel. Gail Hillebrand, unfortunately, said, tell your Attorney General now what you're not happy about. So we'll just pass over that piece. But I really do appreciate your coming here. I'd be happy to answer any questions about the workshop, the AG's role in this, or the Attorney General's office in general. Thanks so much. Questions? Whew. I'm fortunate that I'm either so thorough or so dense that there wasn't one question compared to the rest of the speakers. Please, Gail.
Steve, let me rephrase. What I wanted to say was tell your Attorney General. Excellent complaint unit. What problems you need to get solved, and you want to give that number again?
Yeah. Thanks, Gail. And that is, I mean, it's interesting when you think of an Airtel wireless. That came to us from a consumer complaint. When you think about my example with Julie Brill this morning, where the MCI won $100 overcharge or a penalty became $1.4 million. The complaints that we generate and that we end up working on and we end up litigating on behalf of consumers, we're not representing the consumer, we're representing the state's interests or otherwise. They come through that opportunity of making a complaint and a concern. I mean, a chunk of what we do from a consumer protection standpoint is like these working together on multi-state groups, but a lot of it, which is critically important, comes right through our complaint line, and then staff coming up and saying, here's an issue that we're starting to see all over, and we need to get out in front of it. John.
One of the things we're seeing now that federal health care reform has done is this next legislative session, there's going to be a lot of implementation and things like that to get that bill carried out here in the state. Is there anything part of this bill besides enforcement that you're going to have to do as part of this next legislature to try and implement the bill?
And the question, we have a legislature coming up soon. Is there anything that we're going to do kind of in tandem or otherwise to help implement the federal law? I mean, the nice thing about what the federal law essentially does is it gives us the same authority that the federal regulators have. There's times when we need to call and check off a box, and if our laws are more strict, it doesn't preempt them. But with that said, that Allie Bovington, who's also in my office, said, Steve, you have 18 bills or something like this legislative session. So we don't have a consumer package. We may have a couple consumer bills, but they're not directly tied to this. And it's not the challenges in some respects. I don't see it as the challenges that healthcare is having with the feds and states.
My perspective is a little different than most people in the room. I'm from the law enforcement community, and we hear a lot of the lawsuits that are filed, and I'm wondering, in conjunction, are there any changes federally that may be coming in the criminal code that is going to allow us to pursue criminal prosecutions in addition to financial solutions to these issues?
And I think that the answer is, unfortunately, no. I mean, that you've seen some of the challenges, we just had another woman who had wired money based on this grandparent scam that she got a phone call and said, somebody said, it's my grandchild, I need you to wire money immediately, put out $4,000. I mean, there's always a fine line, I guess, between what is completely morally reprehensible and what's criminal. And there are some of these cases, these actions, that actually start as consumer actions and have gone criminal. But I don't think that there's any real concerted push right now to change the criminal laws to try to make it, because I guess to make it cover more of the consumer. Well, thank you very, very much for being an attentive audience and not recognizing I've already been up here.